Welcome, everyone. My name is Cecilia Freeman-Levin, and I am the Policy Director with ASISTA. I am joined today by my incredible colleague, Amy Chung. Hello, Amy.
Hey, everybody.
And so today's webinar is on what I think is an extremely important and interesting topic. I am very excited about this webinar because it goes into detail about how to try to find some of the pieces of the puzzle that often present themselves in our clients' cases. So often we hear stories wondering how we can find that one piece of information to corroborate the details that our clients are relating and what systems are accessible to us. And not only that, but what are those time frames that we can get it all in? So I think this is a very important and timely webinar. It is something that I think a lot of us just kind of breeze through on our, or make assumptions about what's available. And it, for me, has particularly kind of taught me a lot about what is new and out there and available to try to find some of the information that is really relevant and pertinent to our cases. Amy, do you want to do some housekeeping on CLE?
Sure. So this webinar has been approved for 2 hours of Texas CLE credit. So if you are barred in Texas, then you should have entered your bar number in the registration form when you signed up for this webinar. And if you did that, then we will submit that information ourselves to Texas, so you won't have to do anything. If you are barred in another state and would like to get a certificate of attendance, please email us. Our email addresses will be on the last slide of the presentation, so you can email us and we'll get the certificates of attendance out to you. If you are barred in Texas but did not enter your bar number into the registration form, then it's the same thing. Just email us and we'll make sure to get that information in there. A couple other housekeeping bits. We are very grateful for the support of the Office on Violence Against Women through the U.S. Department of Justice, which is providing funding and support for today's webinar. And there's also, for today, we're going to be doing some polling, we're going to be doing some screen sharing, and then we'll also have some discussion time. So there should be a chat box to the right of your screens where you can enter in questions or anything that you want to share with the group. And there's also a hand-raising function at the top of your screen if there is anything that you want to raise in that way. I'm seeing a question here. Will there be Spanish translations for today's webinar? We do not have simultaneous translation in Spanish today, and there is not Spanish closed captioning for today's webinar. But you can reach out to us and we can see about getting these slides translated.
But okay, thank you very much for that question, and it is something that we would be happy to try to accommodate after today's presentation. So here is what we hope you are able to get out of today. How do you find the things that you're looking for? This is not only kind of like reminding me of a U2 song, but where can you find client records from government agencies, private institutions? What are some databases that might be available to you? How might you be able to obtain criminal and civil records to support your client's FOIA case, their U visa case, their T visa case? And the first place we are going to start with is FOIA, which is Freedom of Information Act requests. If I could see by a showing of your virtual hands, how many people have submitted FOIAs with regard to their VAWA, U, or T visa cases? Oh my goodness. Francesca, Carly, so all of you are incredible experts on this, or some of you, and so I think that's something that I always enjoy about this webinar is to learn strategies from you. So for all of those of you with your virtual hands raised, If you do have best practices and strategies that have worked for you, or share what hasn't worked for you as we discuss FOIA, please do share those with us in the chat box, because I think it's really important to kind of share these strategies and best practices as we go through practicing and preparing these applications. So with FOIA, the first thing we're going to start with FOIA is a hypo. And so your client for today is Pauline. And Pauline wants to file a VAWA self-petition. She knows that she entered the United States 3 times, but is not sure of those dates. Once, she was detained by Customs and Border Patrol, but later released. She thinks that she was supposed to go to court, but she never went, and she doesn't have any of the paperwork that she received from the Customs and Border Patrol. Her abuser frequently threatens to call ICE on her if she reported him to the police, but Pauline doesn't know if that ever actually happened. And Pauline previously filed an application for adjustment of status based on a prior family petition filed by her abuser, but she doesn't know the status of that case. So I just want to take a minute and think about this hypo. And if we can just throw out there in the chat box, what kind of information do you need? What are the things that we need to kind of figure out just by kind of reading over this hypo? What are some things that we need more information on? What are some things that we are just like, wait a second, no, we need to know more about this? So Rebecca asked, we need to know the entries. When did Pauline come in? We need to know whether or not she possibly has a prior deportation order. We need to know what's going on with the adjustment of status application from her prior filing. Was she ever given an NTA? How many recorded entries are there? And also, what kind of entries are there? Did she enter in with a visa? Did she enter in without inspection? You know, all of these things are things we do not have any information about her manner of entry and her dates of entry, and if there is anything about an immigration court proceeding, right? And so even in here, and why are these things important? Why are these things, so these dates, these NTA orders, why are these things important? Right. I mean, it affects, exactly, Martin says it affects her her filing. It affects knowing whether or not she has a prior removal order. It affects the posture of your case. And so not only are there kind of very important things that we need to know, but also they touch upon different government agencies, right? And each of these 3 bullet points involves a separate administrative agency. This first bullet point, we're dealing with Customs and Border Protection. The second bullet point, we're dealing with ICE. And this third bullet point, we're dealing with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service. So what you have here are just multiple gaps in information that are going to be relevant and pertinent to her case, and we're dealing with different agencies that you're going to have to contact to find more information about it. So what is FOIA? What is the Freedom of Information Act, and how does it relate to your works in your filing? So FOIA has been around since 1967. and it gives people the right to access information from any federal agency. And federal agencies are required to provide information requested under FOIA unless it falls under one of 9 different exemptions, which protects interests like privacy, national security, and law enforcement. You can find the entire list online. I know that immediately following this webinar, you are going to look up exemptions to FOIA, and you can get the whole lot of them. But some of the exemptions, again, relate to national security. It revolves around whether or not information is prohibited from disclosure by another federal law, right? So something like 8 USC 1667, the VAWA kind of confidentiality provisions might be another law that impacts FOIA. Information that if disclosed would invade a person's personal privacy, and also a kind of exemption for law enforcement purposes that would impact whether or not a FOIA request would interfere with law enforcement proceedings. And there's also an exemption, in addition to these exemptions, there's 3 different what they call exclusions. And those are kind of categories that relate to law enforcement and national security records. So the first exclusion kind of deals with whether or not there is an ongoing criminal law enforcement investigation, where that person might not know that there is an investigation, and so that prevention could impact the investigation. The second exclusion is talking also criminal law related and protects kind of the existence around information and records around informants. And the third one has to deal with the FBI and kind of other intelligence and counterintelligence efforts in matters that might be classified. So those exclusions might not have anything to do with your cases, but in terms of whether or not there is information that might be considered for a law enforcement purpose or protection of privacy, that there are different exemptions that could impact whether or not you would get that information. And so something else that is really important here is that it deals with records and not information. And so that's important. It is a distinction that is very nuanced, but it's important. So it's not like you can just treat FOIA like a Siri, right? Like, hey Siri, does Paulina have a removal order, right? And you can kind of get that information. FOIA is about records. It is about whether or not there might be a documentation or something that talks about the type of thing that you are trying to find the answer to. So does Pauline have a removal order is seeking information versus I am requesting a copy of any and all orders issued by immigration judge or EOIR regarding Pauline, and that's a different thing. So that is the difference between information and records. You're requesting a copy of any and all documents related to an immigration judge order related to this particular person. And so I just want to update the question about, and so then how about FOIA? And like, how does this help you? It can help uncover some of those missing details about prior filings, about these entries and exits that, especially if there are multiple ones. And they can discover if there was abuser contact with an immigration agency, which is something that I think is often a concern in our clients' cases and is such a common threat when we are dealing with immigrant survivors, as that one of the principal methods to maintain power and control in these abusive relationships is the threat of contacting immigration enforcement. And it's important to do these things at the outset because when we're preparing these cases, one of the things that we have to show and provide is the evidentiary standard of any credible evidence, right? And part of what is important in that evidentiary standard is assessing whether or not there are inconsistencies or there are mistakes. And knowing that ahead of time and being able to kind of formulate, okay, here are some discrepancies. Are they material? And if not, why not? And if they are material, what else do I need to show to explain them? Having all that information up front is going to better situate your client for success at the start and prevent requests for evidence. And so this is why this process is really important, to provide that clarity, to find those puzzle pieces, and to make sure that you are situating your client's case in the best posture possible to make sure that the agency has what it needs to make a decision. Something which I have recently learned and find extremely exciting is you can confirm whether USCIS sent notices, whether or not they sent a denial, whether or not they sent an RFE. And so this is dealing with keystroke FOIAs. And if I make a mistake, Amy, please feel free to jump in because I am super excited about this as well.
Hey, sister, I just wanted to check. Are you on the, okay, just wanted to make sure which slide you're on.
Yeah, so exactly. So I think this is something that I just covered about why getting the client's own records is important, to get those puzzle pieces that you might be missing as a prevention measure, and kind of this confirmation about notices vis-a-vis a keystroke FOIA, which we're going to talk about more in just a minute. So where should you send the FOIA? I think this is a spot where I want to do some screen sharing, if we can. So this is a website which kind of houses information about FOIA requests. And you can see here which agency, and that's, if you can kind of start your request, make a request. Some agencies are connected to this portal, so you can do a FOIA request directly through this website. And if they're not available, then they will link you to the appropriate website and resources. So we're going to go down to the index of government agencies, and we're going to find Department of Homeland Security. Is that going to be under D? It is. Wonderful. So here you can kind of see what are the different offices that you could submit a FOIA request to. And so in Pauline's situation, we talked about U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service. Is that there? Yes, it is. We talked about Customs and Border Patrol. We can go back just for a second. All right. So we have Customs and Border Protection, and right below that we have ICE. And so, but there are other, so if we go over to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, for example, if we go to USCIS, and so it says you can request to this agency using the form. And then that will kind of link you to, and that also says what your average processing times are for simple requests, for complex requests, and has more information about the FOIA process through this website and through this portal. But we can go back to the presentation now. All right. We can pull up the site. Okay. So these are, instead of, so again, you can go to FOIA.gov as kind of as a portal, or here are the websites of the different agencies that are kind of relevant to Pauline's case. So when we have USCIS, you can get anything that was related to a prior filing, we could request that from the A file of the client. We can ask about whether or not there's been any communication regarding an abusive partner or abusive parent regarding the client. And we can also ask about electronic records from what's called a keystroke FOIA. And what is has anyone done keystroke FOIAs before? If you could raise your virtual hand. All right, so Una has, great. So if you wanted to share your experience and what you got there, I think that would be great. So again, keystroke FOIAs, I hope you are as excited about them as I am, because you can find information, not only kind of biographic information and the attorneys of record, but especially because now we are seeing an issue and a trend that cases are denied and an RFE, or request for evidence, was never kind of received by the agency. And so these are cases in which it's important to kind of do a keystroke FOIA to see whether or not that RFE was ever sent. So you can get information about when a receipt note was issued, when the biometrics was received, when the application was received by USCIS, when the RFE was sent. And so this is really important, I think, to know those kind of very important kind of dates and when or whether something was issued, which very might well be important to your case if it's denied and you never received an RFE. Amy, is there more that you would like to add about keystroke FOIAs?
I would say that they're a relatively new thing that we've been encouraging people to file when they have these missing RFEs or even missing denial notices. So to the extent that you guys are filing these keystroke FOIAs, we would really like to hear about your experience in terms of how long it's taking to come back and what kind of information you're getting. There is a redacted sample result of a keystroke FOIA in your materials in the little box to the on the right of your screen. So you can see the kind of information that comes back when you request the keystroke records. And these are just the electronic records from your client's A file. So these are electronic entries that the agency is making whenever they take any kind of action on the case. And I haven't seen these come back in regular A file FOIAs before, but if you specifically ask for the keystroke records from your client, they should know what that is. And in the case that we saw, they came back actually pretty quickly, much faster than a regular A file would have come back.
So again, yes, this is a kind of a fairly new, or new to me, tool in our toolbox. And so if you do request them, please do kind of keep us posted about what information you're getting and kind of what is the turnaround time after making these requests. Regarding ICE, that you can get records of ICE interactions with your clients, including detention records, dates of detention, and CBP, you can get records of border apprehensions, of expedited removals, of entry dates. And this is commonly done in conjunction with what they call OBIM, which is, I think, the Office of Biometric Identity Management FOIA, that when you're thinking about dates of entries to doing CBP FOIAs in conjunction with OBIM FOIAs, because sometimes you get information in one that you might not get from the other. So those are also kind of ways that you can get the information and some of the details that are missing in Pauline's case that might be important to know before you file anything.
And the Martin, how you might get information from an OBIM FOIA that you wouldn't get from a CBP FOIA is that a CBP FOIA is typically run based on the client's name, which might be, they might have used a different name at the time of entry. It also might have been spelled in a different way, whereas the OBIM FOIA is run on fingerprints. So that's why the records might be a little bit different from the two agencies.
So Martin asks if you file a keystroke in addition to a regular FOIA or in place of it. So would it be two separate or one? Is there any kind of thoughts you have on strategy, Amy?
It depends what you're looking for and when you need it, I would say. So if what you're looking for is specifically what's in the electronic record, and that's all you need, then you can just do a keystroke FOIA, and that could theoretically be faster. If you need what's in a regular FOIA in addition to what's in a keystroke FOIA, and you're okay with getting all of them at the same time, then you can do it all in one FOIA. Or if you need the keystroke record FOIA faster, and then you're willing to wait for the other one, then you could do both of them. You could do a keystroke, and then you could also do a regular one. And I saw that was also typing a comment. I know that you've done keystroke FOIAs before, so it would be great if you have other experience to share on that point.
Yes, we'd be very interested in learning that. All right. So in our friend Pauline's case, right, there's also something about a court order. And where we might find information about court orders is through doing a FOIA to the Executive Office of Immigration Review at the Department of Justice, which houses immigration courts and the BIA. And so there you can get copies of different orders, of filings, of records, of hearings. And also I think what is interesting too is that you could also contact the immigration court itself to try to get to listen to a transcript of a proceeding. So I think we're going to talk about that in a little bit as well. But it's talking about what prior orders are, what information is out there that relates to a client's matter in immigration court. We did just talk about the OBIM, which is the Office of Biometrics and Information. Office of Biometric Identity Management. Again, that talks about records of border apprehensions and removals done by biometrics. And then you can also do a FOIA to the Department of State with regard to consular records as well. So there might be reasons to, and I think something that we commonly hear, like, who do we need to FOIA? And I think that, again, is going to be a case-by-case determination. If you have multiple entries, if you are concerned that there might be a prior removal order, or if there's a prior filing and there's no information about that prior filing. So kind of who you FOIA is going to depend upon kind of like what are those missing puzzle pieces that you need to have those answers to. And so these are just kind of some of the places and agencies that are involved in, commonly involved in survivor-based protection. Okay, pop quiz. Which agency would you FOIA if you wanted to know whether or not Pauline was placed in removal proceedings? All right. Well, I'll keep it open for 10 more seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, we can end poll. Okay, so we have 77% of EOIR, but there's also 13.6% that says ICE. What would be the benefit in doing both EOIR and ICE to find out whether or not your client was in removal proceedings? Why would you kind of choose to do both of those? All right, I see some folks are typing. So we know, EOIR, right, to see whether or not there's those prior removal orders, because as we mentioned before, that doing those FOIAs to EOIR, we can kind of see what those final orders are. But, there are some extremely good points being made, because we don't know whether or not there's been any immigration judge orders entered on the case yet, right? And so, ICE can serve you with the NTA, with a charging document. And so depending on the posture of the case, I think it's good, people have suggested that, maybe reaching out to both of those agencies to find out what the, if there is a judge's order, what that order is, and if not, to get a copy of those charging documents. Good job, everyone. Okay. So we decided to submit a FOIA to request EOI to find out whether or not Pauline has been placed in proceedings, and if so, the status of those proceedings. So what would you request? How would you frame it? Understanding that you need to get records and not information. What are some ideas and how you would consider framing the request in FOIA? Again, we're looking for the version that is not Hey Siri. How would you do it, Amy?
Oh, we got a response in the chat box. So Martin says, all records relating to the A number. Una says, I am requesting all records of the alien, the person's name, their number.
Right, and if we don't have an A number, we can do date of birth. Excellent. It's, or any aliases, nationalities, so any and all records related to, right? That could include, what other things might be available, do you think, through EOIR?
Prior removal orders.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. All right. And so you can have any and all orders issued by an immigration judge. This might be kind of a motion to continue order, or just, any change of addresses, EOIR 33s that were submitted on behalf of the client. You can do what is called the Form I-213, which is a record of deportable and inadmissible alien, which talks about information about respondents' alleged country of origin and removability. It has portions where it discusses immigration history or criminal history, encounters with CBP. Right. So again, what's important here is your specificity. So you can't just ask, please confirm whether the client has a removal order. You must ask for the document itself. So as I mentioned before, they have records of hearings. So if you know for sure that Pauline was in immigration court, and in which court, like so say she was in Arlington, Virginia, you can request the records and recordings from the court. You can call the court administrator to confirm what the policy and process is from listening to those recordings. And so the other thing that I want to kind of think about, if we can just go back here to our poll slide, or which agencies you would contact. Now, USCIS is probably not going to have any records, right, about whether or not they were placed in removal proceedings. CBP, you can kind of learn more about border apprehensions, maybe where there's any kind of misrepresentation, maybe there's another A number. EOIR, you're going to have probably a good source. And then again, ICE could have records related to removal proceedings, maybe information about stay requests. The OBIM is going to have information about border apprehensions. And so I think that we've talked about how ICE and EOIR would probably be the best bets in these situations. Now, we're going to go
going back to EOR for a moment. I just want to make sure that folks know that the records request through the court is not a FOIA, but you could theoretically get the exact same information. So depending on what the processing time is at the court where you're requesting the information from and EOIR's general FOIA processing time, sometimes it can be faster to just go through the court and get a records request versus filing a FOIA. But it just depends on, which court it is, how long it's taking, how helpful they are being with the records request that you're making. So it depends on the facts of your situation. But a records request can sometimes be a really effective and fast way of getting the same records that you want.
Right, exactly. And kind of whether or not, knowing the court that you need to reach out to as well, and kind of getting a sense of what their process and procedures are for doing this. I think that's a great point. Thank you, Amy. Okay, our next poll. Which agency would you FOIA if you wanted to find out whether or not Pauline's abuser made allegations that she, quote, married him for papers? Again, these are all anonymous. There's no judgment from us at all. This is kind of your best guess. Okay, we can end the poll. All right. So 95% of you said USCIS and ICE. And yes, I think that is probably the most likely agencies that would have information about those. USCIS, whether or not he reached out to the district office or someone at the customer service hotline to make that allegation, or also through ICE. The office within ICE, the Homeland Security's investigation, HSI, has a form that people can make allegations of fraud. And so this is kind of the agency that you would reach out to find out whether or not abuser had contacted the agencies.
And Yuna is also suggesting the Department of State, particularly if one of the spouses is outside the United States.
That's an excellent point.
DOS FOIAs do take a very long time to come back, but they could certainly be a source. And why would you want to know if the abuser had contacted one of the agencies?
Do people have any thoughts about why that would be important?
So as to determine whether or not the agency began any investigation. Definitely true. There could have been a fraud investigation.
Mm-hmm. Right. So we're talking about whether or not you are converting kind of a family petition to VAWA. And it also, I think, could be something that would be potentially useful to show that the abuser made good on threats, in terms of how it could be a pattern and practice for the extreme cruelty, right? And if you try to do violations of VAWA confidentiality, we have heard of cases where abusers reaching out to ICE has had negative immigration consequences for survivors. And so knowing whether or not there's a potential violation, as Raquel mentioned, of VAWA confidentiality, to which that there is a formal complaint process with the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties that could be started. There's a civil penalty of $5,000 that is attached to these violations. So to find out whether or not that this is something that is potentially going to be an issue under VAWA confidentiality for fraud purposes and others. Anything you would add to that, Amy?
No, I think those are all really great points. I think the concern is always that we're worried that the agencies will be making decisions based on these fraud allegations, right? But they will never tell you. And so sometimes you don't even hear about anything until you get the FOIA results back and you find evidence in there.
Right, and I think it's particularly important because so with the VAWA confidentiality provisions, which are codified at 8 USC 1367, have this provision that DHS or DOJ or Department of State is not supposed to take an adverse action in the survivor's case based on information solely provided by the abuser, the abuser's family, or someone in their household, right? But what they commonly say is that, well, it's not solely because we checked other databases, and you can kind of see whether or not something happened, but the impetus was the abuser reaching out to ICE or reaching out to USCIS or the Department of State. So I think it's an important thing to know if these threats are present in your cases. Okay. Now the very important question is the how. They prefer to do it electronically, which is better for the record keeping. It could be faster. But again, it's going to depend on the agency. So if you go to the FOIA.gov, or if you go to the other websites that we have listed in this presentation to find out how they want the information presented. There is a form called the G639, which is not required, but it does require your client's permission to disclose those information and those documents to you. And again, specificity is key, right? Whether or not you are requesting someone's entire A file, whether or not you are just looking for whether or not there is a removal order or a notes from an adjustment interview or recordings from the master calendar hearing. So again, being specific and knowing that if you are more general, if you say something like the complete A file, that can often take more time than if you're looking for something specific and individual. So there are different tracks with regard to FOIA. Track 1 is what is kind of known as a simple track, right? And so that's when you're really kind of looking for a specific thing, right? And if you're looking for a specific thing, then you limit the request. And the more complex and the more you want, the longer that it'll take. So track 2 FOIA can be up to 6 months or more. And then there's something called a track 3 FOIA, which is for individuals who are in removal proceedings. And in those cases, you want to provide proof and documentation that your client is in removal proceedings. And so that is what's called an expedited FOIA, this track 3 FOIA. So what we saw from that FOIA.gov website is that the average processing time in 2018 for USCIS was 35 working days for simple requests and 80 working days for complex ones, so that can often take much longer than 80 days for complex requests, particularly if you're getting kind of an entire A file where there's multiple prior filings. That could take a minute. But you can modify it after you submit it to try to see exactly what you need and try to get those results faster. For those folks who have done FOIA work, do you want to share kind of what your turnaround time has been for USCIS FOIAs? We can just go for there. For those of you, I saw that Carly and some others have done some FOIAs, and to kind of share what your processing times have looked like. All right, so Maria says 2.5 months.
And was that for an A file FOIA? Or what kind of FOIA was that for?
Or kind of like a...
And Cecilia, how long is the agency supposed to take to turn around a FOIA?
The agencies, I think, are supposed to, it's supposed to be what, like, about, it's like
20 days, right?
20 days, right?
20 days by statute, and then they can invoke an exception for an additional 10 days, which they always invoke. But it actually
Right.
only gives them, the statute only allows them 30 days, and they just completely disregard the statute. Like, it's very rare for FOIAs to come back in less than 30 days.
Right. Because even Maria's, which is 2.5 months, and regarding information related to a family petition, so I'm just assuming this might be a prior filing. That it took, again, because that was with specificity, it took 2.5 months. That's good to know.
What would you say if people have practical concerns about waiting for a FOIA to come back before they file?
I think that's always something that you're going to be up against. You're going to be up against 6 months if you have a certification for a U visa. You might be up against a 2-year anniversary of a divorce in a VAWA case, right? And so I think that there are going to, or an age-out issue for derivatives in a U visa case or T visa case. So there are often going to be time constraints where you're going to need to get an application in and filed before the information is coming back to your FOIA so that you can kind of get the information to corroborate the claims in your client's case. And I think in those cases, you know, with that tension that you can say, this is what I know, that we are finding out information about A issue, B issue, C issue, and we can supplement the record once we have that additional information. But I think that when you're dealing with a situation where there's a tension between a deadline, an important deadline, and waiting to get FOIA information back, to say what you know and indicate what you don't, and that you're trying to find more information to provide a more fuller explanation on it. Is there more that you would add to that?
I think that's right. And I would also say that depending on what kind of information you're not sure about and are trying to figure out through the FOIA, you can try to see which agencies are processing them faster and to see if any of the agencies that are doing it a little faster would be likely to have the kind of information that you want. So for example, if you want to figure out when Pauline was entering and exiting, and you want to figure out what happened at this border apprehension, you can look at OBIM and CBP to see who's processing faster and see if one of them could come back in time.
Right. And similarly, if you're trying to find out information about an NTA, right, that you can try EOIR, or if you know the court, to go down and do one of those records requests that you were talking about. So sometimes there are multiple avenues to try to get the information that you need.
And we have a question here to explain a little more on how to complete a keystroke FOIA. So it's a USCIS FOIA, and if all you're requesting is the keystroke records, you're providing your client's name, their A number if you have it, DOB, country of origin, like information that they would need to identify the person, and then you make your request. So in one successful request that we saw, the person said that they were requesting, quote unquote, the keystroke records for their client. So it's a pretty basic request, and USCIS understood what they meant and sent them the appropriate results. So it's
right, and
potentially a very straightforward process.
Right, and we're happy to share if you contact us afterward. We have like a redacted request as well, so we can kind of share a little bit about what that request looked like, if you are interested. Okay. All right, back to Pauline. Pauline is also eligible for a U visa, and you file one, and you receive an RFE for a police report and an arrest that Pauline had for trespassing back in 2004. Pauline requested a copy from the police, but they said that the record could not be released. The police refused to provide written confirmation of their refusal to provide the record. Pauline wrote an affidavit about her efforts to obtain this document, but USCIS issued a notice of intent to deny because they, quote, could not conduct a full discretionary analysis without the report. What do you do? This seems like a rock and hard place situation. Amy, am I turning this over to you?
Sure. So just by a show of hands, have any of you guys encountered this scenario that Pauline and her attorney are facing? We've got one hand. We're seeing a number of similar situations through TAs these days, whether it's because the police department refuses to provide it or they say that they can't provide it for whatever reason, it's not accessible. The client is actually trying to obtain this document to provide to USCIS, and USCIS is just not satisfied with an affidavit from the client about her efforts to obtain the police report. And so there are a couple of things you can do here. You can obviously, one option is to push back on USCIS's insistence for police reports, particularly in cases that did not result in conviction. But if it's for something like trespass, it's potentially something very straightforward. And in this case, the police are not providing the report. It's actually, the issue is that the police won't provide it, not that your client is refusing, right? And so to the extent that you're able to get confirmation from the police that they won't provide it, then theoretically that should satisfy USCIS. So then how do you get this confirmation? So the Freedom of Information Act is not just for federal agencies. Every single state has its own version of FOIA. The states are not subject to the federal version of FOIA. So they have their own version of FOIA. Sometimes they're called FOIA. Sometimes they're called an Open Records Act. In some states, they might also have an Open Meetings Act. And the purpose for all of these acts in these states is the same as the purpose of the federal FOIA, right? It's to promote government transparency because we're a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And so depending on what the state statute looks like, you should be able to access a lot of government records, potentially including police records. And even if you can't, the government does actually have to respond to you in writing, right? And so this may be the way that you could get confirmation that the results either are not available or cannot be disclosed. And that could be the written documentation that you could provide to USCIS to satisfy them. If you are looking to do a state FOIA or a state Open Records Act request, there is a website that has basically a database of this information for every single state. And so they have the statutes for each state. They have sample FOIA request letters that you can use. They have contact information for each state's FOIA hotline if one exists. And this can be really useful because it can sometimes be difficult to figure out how to make your request, where to send your request, who's in charge of fulfilling your FOIA request. Because sometimes, especially for something like a local police department, you might not be making the request to the state. Instead, you might be making it to the city or the county. So it depends what is the agency that you're trying to get the records from and how the structure works in that particular location. And so trying to figure that out can be a little bit tricky, especially if it's in an area where you're not used to the system. Like, let's say your client is from a different state and you're trying to get records from this other state that you've never had to deal with before. And to the extent that you are trying to find local records, like police department records, sometimes it can be useful to look at the city or county website because sometimes they'll have a dedicated FOIA officer in more populous locations. In other places, it might just be the city attorney or one of the county attorneys who will be in charge of fulfilling FOIA requests. Okay. We've got a couple questions here. So, saying that you can ask for a FOIA but get a criminal history record which might have the arrest record. So what you get back from the FOIA is going to depend on the state. So in some states, they might say that those kinds of records are not available, and so then you would get a written confirmation from them that this record cannot be available, and you can submit that to USCIS. In other situations, you might actually get the arrest record. In this situation, it sounds like Pauline and her attorney were willing to submit the arrest record anyway, and so that might not be a problem for you in this particular situation.
And then we have Martin's question about whether or not USCIS could deny an application even after written confirmation from the police that they can't or won't produce the record because they wouldn't be able to exercise the full extent of their discretion. We've seen cases like this where these denials have been occurring even if there's just no record?
I actually have not seen a denial on discretion for not having submitted a police report where the person provided documentation from the agency that the record was not available. And I think if you had that situation, what I would look at is 8 CFR, let me find the site here, 8 CFR 103.2 B2 little Roman numeral 2. And so that is a regulation that says that where a record does not exist, the applicant or petitioner must submit an original written statement on government letterhead establishing this from the relevant government or other authority. So in theory, that should satisfy USCIS's request, such that they shouldn't consider it a negative discretionary factor that you have not submitted the police report. But I haven't seen denials on this particular, in that particular fact scenario before. Okay, so how does it work? Depending on the state, you can request all kinds of things. So you can request police records. Sometimes the USCIS or ICE will say that your client is a member of a gang, but your client denies being a member of the gang. So if you need to try to figure out where this information is coming from, then sometimes you might be able to get it through a state FOIA for the gang database information. Also, if you need a copy of the law enforcement agency's visa certification policies, you might also be able to get it through this process. It really just depends on how the state statute on FOIA or Open Records Request is, Open Records Act is worded, because they have their own exemptions and their own exclusions and things like that. Many states will have a deadline for responding to a FOIA, and oftentimes they're faster than the federal government. So for example, in Virginia, I think their deadline is 5 days. So it could potentially be a very quick turnaround for you to get a response to your FOIA request. And in other states, they don't have a deadline. So you'd have to try it out to see if they would still try to get back to you as soon as possible, or if it's one of those things where it could languish for a while. But the nice thing is that if there aren't responsive records, they will respond to you to say that there are no responsive records. Okay, background checks. So it's the reason for doing background checks is pretty similar in most cases to the reason for doing a FOIA, right? You want to make sure that your client doesn't have issues related to negative discretion or potential inadmissibilities that your client has not told you about, whether it's because they didn't understand what you were asking, or they didn't understand that what happened to them was an arrest or a charge or conviction, which happens a lot, right? And so background checks can be super, super helpful in making sure that what you're submitting in an application is correct and that you're not missing issues that are going to show up in an RFE or a NOID or a denial down the road. Okay, so quick poll here. So yes or no, I have represented a client who initially told me that he or she had never been arrested, charged, or convicted of any crime, but who later disclosed that she had been arrested, charged, or convicted. Okay, I think we can go ahead and end the poll. It looks like 77% of folks are saying yes, this has happened to them, and a very fortunate 22% of respondents said no, this has never happened to them. So there are lots of strategies about how to phrase these questions so that your client will understand what you mean by arrested, charged, or convicted. Oftentimes, as I said, sometimes folks don't realize that what happened to them was an arrest or a criminal charge or a conviction, and so that's why they might answer no when you ask them. But this is a really common issue that we see in a lot of cases, and it can cause a lot of problems if you submit an application where your client says that they've never been arrested and then it turns out that they have been. So let's go back to Pauline. Pauline told you that her 2004 arrest was her only arrest and that she'd never been convicted of any crime. And as you are working on her affidavit, she mentions that time in 1998 that she was in jail for a night. So when Pauline tells you this, what do you do? Maybe you could put your thoughts into the chat box to share with folks. So Mariana says, do a FOIA. What kind of FOIA would you do? FBI. So I would probably do an FBI background check, which is technically not under the Freedom of Information Act. It's just a request for your own client's criminal background check, but yes. Claire says criminal background check in the state where she was in jail, also a great idea. But yes, the idea is that obviously Pauline either didn't understand before when she said that the 2004 arrest was her only arrest. Maybe she didn't understand that in 2009 that she must have been arrested if she was in jail. Or there is some information here that's missing, right? And so you can ask Pauline for more details, but it's entirely possible that she just won't have those details. She might not understand exactly what happened. And so that's where doing a background check can be really helpful. So how do we do this? Where and when? It's very similar to doing a FOIA. Ideally, you would be able to do a background check before you file the petition so that you don't have to course correct later on after USCIS tells you that, oh, looks like your client has all this criminal history that you didn't disclose. And then where would you do the background check? As folks were saying, the FBI is a really great option. So the nice thing about the FBI ones is that they will check the national crime databases. And so if your client's been moving around a lot, if she's not sure exactly where all the places that she's lived, then the FBI check will theoretically get you all the information from around the country. So you only have to do one background check for all of it. And it will also include immigration-related arrests and removals. So if for some reason you weren't able to get that from the immigration agency, that's also an option. One thing that I have found personally is that it does sometimes miss the state and local records if they're not in those databases that the FBI is using to run their check. And so that's where it can be helpful to do FBI plus state plus local. But the FBI is generally the biggest one. And that's the same information that USCIS should be accessing when they do their own background check on your client as well. The state background checks can also be really useful. So it's just that depending on where and when the arrest or criminal history occurred. Sometimes state background checks can also miss information from certain localities. And then the other nice thing about state and local background checks is that many states and larger cities, some counties, will have online electronic databases that are very easy to access and very quick to access, so that you can just run a quick search on your client and get a pretty good idea of what's going on, even while you're waiting for a more thorough background check to come through. So when you look up your client on these online databases, that's not an actual background check, but you're just looking up your client's name to see if there are any hits that are coming up on these electronic databases. And so we've got a question here: are there less expensive options? If your client really can't afford the FBI background check or the state background checks, then you can look at the state and local databases, which are free. At least all the ones that I've seen have been free, to look up your client's name to see if there's anything in there. One thing I would caution you about is that sometimes these databases will have misspelled names, or if your client has two last names, maybe they only have one of them. Sometimes the DOB is wrong. So you want to cast a broad net when you're looking to make sure that you don't miss anything. And these electronic databases are obviously based on name checks, not fingerprints, whereas background checks can be based on the name or on prints, and prints are generally going to give you a more exhaustive and accurate search than the name for the reasons that we talked about earlier. So if you are doing a name, make sure to run all the aliases, combinations of different versions of your client's name that you know about. Okay, so let's pull up a screen share so we can see how to locate free state and local background checks. All right, so we're just going to do one here. So we're looking at DC right now. And so if you weren't sure whether or not your state or locality had one of these free online databases, I would just do the name of your state and then case search, or court records search, or something like that. So for DC, you could do DC case search. And so for DC, I know that they have this free online database, and so you go down here, and then you click search, and then they almost always are going to have some kind of CAPTCHA that I usually can't read. So let's see if this works. Great. Some of them will require you to create an account. It's a free account, and then you just log into your account in order to access the records. And so here, we don't know the case number, and so we're just going to do a name search, right? And then you can see over here that there are different types of cases, and so you could narrow it down if you knew exactly what you were looking for. Oftentimes, when you're doing these searches, oh, let's not search me. Oftentimes when you are doing these searches, you want to cast a really broad net. I guess this would be a way to find out if I had something I didn't know about. But so you want to cast a really broad net. So I typically do not narrow down the fields at all. I will just put in a name, and then if there are just too many things just to look through, then I'll see about narrowing it down from there, right? But let's just start with John Smith. See what we get. This did work about half an hour ago. Okay, great. So we can see here that there are a ton of matches for John Smith. And we can see that they're all different filing dates, right? So you can sort it by filing date. Maybe we want to look at something in a criminal case. So we can see over here, defendant criminal, right? We wouldn't just want to be looking up like a civil case. So then I know that these are super old, so they're probably not going to have the kinds of records we're looking for. Let's look at something newer. So here we go. We have the filing date is 3/4/2011. John Smith, defendant criminal misdemeanor. So let's, oh, that one I have to pay for. Oh, but they still have docket information here. Okay, so even if there are things that they need you to pay for in order to access, there is other information that's going to be public here, right? And so you're going to be able to see all the court entries from the case. And there's typically a little bit of information about the individual, so you can try to distinguish your John Smith from all the other 5,000 John Smiths that are in the database. So sometimes there will be a date of birth there. Sometimes there could be other information that could help you figure out whether or not this is actually your client or somebody else just with a similar name. All right, so let's stop sharing. I'm going to, there we go, okay. So that's just one, and most major cities are going to have something like this. Some counties might if they're really big, and most states will have something. So it just depends on where you are and or where the client has lived and what you're trying to look up. And each one is going to have different rules too about whether you have to create an account or pay for particular documents, but typically this kind of docket information is going to be free. Okay, and so let's talk a little bit more about FBI background checks. Just by show of hands, for those of you who have submitted FBI background checks, do you submit them electronically? If you do submit them electronically, please raise your hand. Sorry, that was not clear phrasing there. Just one. Okay, so how about everybody else? Do other people submit your background checks on paper, on hard copy? If you do, if you could raise your hand. Would be great. Okay, so it looks like most people submit their FBI background checks on paper. So we want to recommend that folks try submitting these electronically because they are supposed to come back much, much faster than these hard copy ones, than the paper filings. And there are instructions at this link that's on your screen right now that walk you through how to submit the FBI background check online. You do still have to submit fingerprints. So when you do the electronic request, it'll tell you how to submit the fingerprints. Typically, you get the fingerprint card that you always have. You get the fingerprints done. Some folks will do them in their own offices. They have people who are trained for that, but you can also get it from USCIS and other places, and then you submit that to the FBI. And then once the FBI gets those hard copy prints, then they're able to process the request. But this is supposed to be much faster than doing the whole thing hard copy. And so especially where you have time constraints and you don't want to be worrying about waiting for FBI background checks to come back, this could be a really great option for people to try out. And let us know how it works. Okay, I see we have somebody typing, so I'll just give it a second. USPS does the fingerprints? Yes, they do. According to the FBI website, USPS can do fingerprints for the FBI. You need to provide the card, I think, the regular FBI card. So that could be an option. Also, I don't know that every single USPS office is going to know how to do these, so you may have to do a little legwork to try to figure out what's the best option for your client. But yes, that should be an option. Okay.
And from what I understand, that's like a fairly recent development, right? I think that there's a fairly recent, but, and they might have just been doing in certain areas, but I think I would just contact the post office in your area to see if it's an option.
Yeah, ideally you could contact them before sending the client over, but
well, yes, exactly. Because I know that in DC, you know, I think in DC and some other places they might be rolling it out, but I think before you send your client there to find out if they actually do it, it's a good plan.
Yeah, and Laura has provided the link in the chat box, so it's not quite everywhere yet. So it'll depend on your location, but hopefully they'll roll it out to more locations soon. Okay, so Cecilia, would you like to start us on using records to document the case?
Right. So previously we kind of talked a little bit about using FOIA and using FBI background checks to kind of fill in the gaps. And so we're going to talk about, not only is that important for filling those gaps and finding the information you don't know, but also kind of using that information to support and be part of the evidence that you submit in your application. So now we're going to go back to Pauline. Pauline says that she was a victim of human trafficking, and the United States and law enforcement agents rescued her from the traffickers in 2012 and interviewed her. She doesn't recall in which city this took place or what agencies the offices were from. And again, that this is now, 8 years ago. Where would you start? Where would you start if you had someone who says they were a victim of trafficking that had occurred 8 years ago, but doesn't really kind of have information about where or what agency was involved? What would be something that you would do just kind of at the outset? Any thoughts? Especially for something that might have happened a while ago? Where's your starting point? Right, so I mean, just starting with FBI or HSI victim coordinator within ICE, that's a good place to start. And I think too, I just want to take a minute to try to do some of this and getting these details, especially if you don't know what city or what agency, and is, what you can glean or at least try to narrow down the field through client interviewing, right? In terms of, what city was it in? Was it something that, if she knows that it occurred within the state that you're living in now, was she in another state? Was that state, what was the climate like? Was it near a beach? Trying to, in as much as you can through interviewing, being able to try to get more information that might give you some leads on where to go next, right? What color were the uniforms that the law enforcement agencies or agents were wearing? So I think, in as much as we can during interviewing and using techniques to try to get information. But again, oftentimes, especially for survivors of trauma, this is very hard to get these details. And so I think that what you can do, if you're able to just figure out, what state this occurred in, something that we can kind of say is something that, Andrea, that you mentioned, is the victim witness coordinators, right? That each state has a victim witness assistance program. And sometimes it is called different things in different states. So like in Maryland, it is the Maryland Attorney General, it's under the Maryland Attorney General's Office, the Director of Victim Services. There's also a state board of victim services, and many kind of prosecutors and other federal agencies have victim witness services. So I think those coordinators could have access to more records and help find out what agency might have been responded, as Claire and Andrea mentioned, like was it FBI, is it HSI, was it state or local, was it the sheriff's office, and who was involved. And so those are really good places and really good community members to reach out to, especially if you have something that occurred long ago, to find out where there might have been those kind of systemic touches when she was interviewed and when she was had that contact with law enforcement. So again, those can also be very good partners in helping fill in the gaps in those situations. How many folks have worked with their victim witness coordinators before to try to get details in their cases? either for their states or HSI or FBI. Have folks coordinated with their victim witness coordinators before? Right? Andrea has, Deanna has. Again, so these are also some really good resources to start with. And the Crime Victims Compensation Fund, right? States have one. In that case example that of the poor John Smith that Amy pulled up, one of the last entries in that case was about Crime Victims Compensation Funds. And every state has a fund for this. And those administrators can also have access to law enforcement records to find out what case it was based on if crime victims compensation was distributed. So they might also be very good resources to find out, at least to kind of give a direction on which agency that you should reach out to that can then kind of lead you to the path into the fact finding that Amy described previously. So again, if someone was a victim of crime and you're able to kind of figure out, you know, if it was in this state or another, that crime victims compensations and your victim witness coordinators can be a really good place to start to flesh out what agency was involved, what it might have been, and kind of to try to fill in those gaps to kind of lead you down the path. Again, because sometimes we're not going to get all the information at the first time, but it's about building those steps to try to get us the information that we're looking for.
And for the Crime Victims Compensation Fund, your client doesn't even have to have received compensation from the fund. You can call the administrator for the compensation fund, and because they have access to all this information and because they're typically very, very familiar with all of the different law enforcement agencies that are operating in their state, that if you can just talk to them and explain the details that you do have, they might be able to help you narrow things down a bit.
Right, like which agency would typically interview a survivor for a trafficking matter? You know, where would that usually kind of, under whose purview would that fall? Right? And again, and if they don't know, then you can reaching out to the FBI or other victim witness coordinators to see whether or not it was a federal issue as well. But they're typically, I think, good places to start. All right. Vital records. Amy.
So sometimes you also want to try to figure out just some really basic information. One example that I've seen is when the abuser files for divorce and he says he doesn't know where their client is so that he can avoid having to serve her, he can avoid having a contested suit. And so he might serve her by publication or something like that, but obviously your client would not know that she had been served by publication, and so she might not even know that she is getting a divorce or that she has already gotten a divorce. And so particularly in a case like a volatile petition where that would be really relevant, it can be really useful just to run a quick search through your state's records to see if there's anything regarding your client that would be relevant to the case. And so each state, just like the criminal records, like what is actually going to be available and how exactly you access it is going to vary by state. It's going to vary by location. So I wouldn't say that there's a general rule here. But in a lot of states, especially court records, which will include things like divorces and name changes, that kind of thing is typically going to be available in an electronic database. You may find that other things that don't involve the court process, like births, deaths, marriages, things like that, that might involve either contacting the agency in person or by mail or something like that to try to get those records. So let's take a look at how this would look if you were to look up a client. Okay. So Maryland has a very nice database where you can look up court records, both civil and criminal. And so here, let's just do a case search. And again, just like the criminal case searches, these are going to be by name, right? And so let's look up John Smith again. And then here we know that we're looking specifically for civil issues. We want to know if there's anything related to a divorce or anything like that that we would need to know for his case. So we're going to leave all the other fields blank because we want to keep it as general as possible and just narrow it down to civil. You don't even have to narrow it down to civil. You could leave it open for all of them, but it'll help limit our search results a little bit. So, try this again. Here we go. Okay. And so here we see that there is a John Smith who got a divorce, except it says that he's the attorney. We're looking for John Smiths who are the defendant or the plaintiff. So you would just look through here and you try to see, okay, is there anything that seems like it would be relevant? If there isn't, then you would feel pretty sure that there isn't anything, that there isn't some hidden divorce that your client doesn't know about here. Okay, great. There are also other times when you're trying to corroborate some medical issue that your client has had. So this could be a U visa case where you're trying to corroborate the substantial abuse. This could also be a VOXA petition where you're trying to corroborate the battery extreme cruelty. Or any number of other cases, right, where you're trying to substantiate something medical related. So how do you do this? Obviously, sometimes your client has everything. Your client shows up with their medical discharge papers and you're good to go. But then there are other times when your client comes to you and says, oh, well, I suffered these injuries and I saw a doctor, but I don't have any records of this. As Cecilia was talking about earlier, when you're filing one of these cases, VAWAs and U visas, you have the any credible evidence rule, right? You're not required to provide a particular piece of information to substantiate the claim. But at the same time, the agency has discretion with respect to how much weight to give to the evidence that you're providing. And also the evidence that you're providing has to be credible, right? And so if your client is saying, oh, well, I suffered a broken jaw and went to the hospital for treatment, and they're saying this in their affidavit, but you have no corroboration of this claim, then you might expect USCIS to ask you to corroborate it. They might question the veracity of your client's claim for something that theoretically would be easy to document, like a broken jaw for which he got treatment, right? And so that's why we do recommend at least trying to get medical records, because in theory these should be available. Sometimes there's a problem in getting these, particularly if there was a question about where your client actually got treatment. So for example, if it was a case where the client was transported to the hospital by ambulance, oftentimes they're not going to know where the ambulance has taken them. Sometimes they are not in a condition to be able to be aware of where they're going and where the ambulance is taking them. The ambulance might be taking them to a hospital that's not familiar to them, that's not the closest to their home. And so when you're trying to figure out where the records could possibly be, and maybe the client hasn't even gotten a bill because maybe they got charity care, or maybe, you know, something happened where they didn't get a bill and so they don't have records of who was treating them, you have to try to figure out where that was. And so what we would do is figure out all of the institutions that might have treated your client. This is probably just going to be based on geographic proximity, and then make their separate request to each one of them. And each of them is going to have a separate process for making the request. They're each going to have their own records unit. You can usually use a standard HIPAA form. It's the same information. Some of them might have their own HIPAA forms that you would have to submit. So this is kind of a tedious process, but to the extent that your client has some kind of medical treatment or injury that you're trying to document, then this is probably your most reliable way to try to figure out what exactly happened. Another option is that if your client was transported by ambulance, then you can try to figure out how to get the ambulance record. In some places it's super easy, like in New York City. In other places, it's not quite as easy. Sometimes you might need to call the police department and ask them. So normally when you call an ambulance to the scene, like which company, and then you go to the companies individually, or if there's a police report, there might be some indication there. So there are a whole bunch of different ways that you can get medical records. Another thing that I want to say about medical records is when you're submitting them, take a look at what they say. Take a look at what they say and think about whether or not the information that's in the document is actually corroborating what your client claims. So for example, if your client is saying that they suffered a broken jaw in an assault that's the basis for their U visa and that they got hospital treatment for this, and what you're providing is a hospital bill that is not itemized, might have a date on it, might not have a date on it. The bill itself is not going to corroborate that your client suffered a broken jaw as a result of this crime, right? What the bill corroborates is that your client received some kind of treatment for some kind of medical issue at this particular location. And so ideally what you would have would be an actual medical record, which you would still want to look at to make sure it doesn't have anything that would be problematic to submit to USCIS. Or in some cases, you might be able to get a physician or the medical provider to do a little write-up with the basic information that USCIS needs, but without all of the other extraneous information that might be unhelpful or confusing. So just something to think about when you're providing medical records. Okay. Last up, ORR. So the Office of Refugee Resettlement does records requests. And this is particularly relevant when you have a client who entered as an unaccompanied child or perhaps an unaccompanied refugee minor, because those are the children who will pass through the hands of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And when the children are in custody, they receive services from therapists and case managers who will document their interactions with the child in a file, in an ORR file. And you can get a copy of this, of these records, through a records request. This is not a Freedom of Information Act request. It's kind of like the difference between a records request to EOIR versus a FOIA request. So the deadlines might be different. There's no deadline for ORR to respond to a records request, although when I've done them, they've been not too slow. There are also different exemptions and things like that. So the rules are a little bit different, but fundamentally the information that you're going to get back is the same. And the information that you're going to get back is going to be about the client. It's not going to be about the sponsor unless the sponsor has also signed an authorization for you to get their records. And the purpose of getting this record would be that the clinicians and the case manager's notes from their interactions with your client will be in the file. For example, sometimes they'll document scars on a child's body. Sometimes they will document interviews. They do intake interviews with all of the kids, right? And so they'll be talking about their upbringing, their family relationships, their reasons for coming, their journey to the United States, things like that. And there is also sometimes information in there of when the child has disclosed any kind of gang issues, whether they were threatened by gangs or whether they had any involvement in gangs and things like that. And this information can be helpful for corroborating claims that your client has made. It can also be useful for doing research. For example, sometimes children report that they were trafficked or abused by their sponsor. Sometimes there can be information in the file that can help corroborate that or give you a lead on where to go next. So this can be really useful for documenting your case. Also, for example, sometimes you'll see unaccompanied children with an in absentia order of removal. And what you find is that the ORR caseworker who sent the pro se change of venue for the child to the immigration court put the wrong address for the child. So you might find that in the EOR file, but you could also theoretically find it in the ORR file. So this is one option for that. And then the other reason to check this record is because there have been recent reports that ORR might share this information with DHS, that this file could be shared with DHS in the context of removal proceedings or theoretically perhaps in other proceedings as well. And so you would want to know what is in the file. What has your client previously said that might be accessible to USCIS or ICE or EOIR when they're looking at the client's case. And then the process for getting this records request is to submit a form called the Request for Case File, which is at the link on the screen. And the timeline depends. Sometimes it can be really fast, sometimes it's slower. It depends on what their backlog is looking like. Okay. And I think we have plenty of time for questions today if folks have other things that they wanted to talk about. I don't know, Cecilia, were there any questions that we missed as we were going through?
I don't think so. I can take a look though. So why don't we just walk through a little bit about what we have for the materials. If you want to say what people have in Amy, kind of walk through the different attachments that they could access.
Sure. So in the little materials that you can download, there is a G639. I'm sure you guys are familiar with these if you've been filing FOIAs. So this is the optional form that you can file with DHS FOIAs. The nice thing about them is that they tell you the information that the agency would need in order to figure out who the subject of the request is, so like name, a number, date of birth, country of origin, all the stuff like that. It also includes the authorization for the client to give you permission to request their records. But as Cecilia said earlier, this G639 is not actually required by any of the agencies. It's just convenient sometimes to know what kind of information you need to include with the request. Next, there is just a blank records request for, this is specific to the Chicago Immigration Court, but the form is pretty much the same. In other courts, they might have something slightly different, so you can talk to the court administrator to get the form that's specific to whichever court you're looking at. But it's just a sample form, so you can see the kind of information that you can request through an EOIR records request. There's also, as we said, the redacted keystroke FOIA results, so you can see what kind of information you might be able to get from a keystroke records FOIA. And as we were saying, that is particularly useful when you're trying to figure out whether or not USCIS actually sent an RFE or denial or other notice that they are saying that they sent to you, because any kind of action like that would need to be logged into their system.
And Amy, Martin asked whether or not we could send out the redacted keystroke request as part of the material.
We can. Yeah, we can. It's pretty bare bones. It is basically, you know, this is my client. I am requesting her keystroke records. But yes, we can send out we can send out a redacted version of that. We're going to send out a follow-up email to everybody with the recording and everything probably in the next few days or next week anyway, and so we'll make sure to include that attachment in that follow-up email.
And Angela asks if we have suggestions on where to go if a CBP FOIA does not show any exits and entries for a client who clearly has many entries and exits.
So
what if the FOIA doesn't have the information that you thought it might?
Yeah, so I think my first question would be whether or not the client had actually been apprehended, because if the client wasn't apprehended, then obviously, you know, there's not going to be any record of that. If they use the
Mm-hmm.
passport, whose passport was it, and do they still have that passport? Their own passport. So if they use their own passport, I would try running an I-94 search. So there's, oh, but they don't have the passport. Do you have the passport number? Because if you have the, and you don't have the passport number, okay. Well, this,
would an FBI check maybe provide that, or OBIM?
I don't know, actually. I don't know that an FBI check would have lawful entries by somebody who's using their own passport, you know? Like,
I don't think so.
FBI tends to have apprehensions as opposed to lawful entries. Yeah, these are all lawful entries. I think the issue is that ICE needs to tell her what her passport number is. Yeah, I mean, in that situation, it's questionable to me whether or not the FBI or OBIM is going to have a record of lawful entries. CBP does definitely have a record of lawful entries, but the way you normally look this up is through the I-94 website, and of course you need the passport number and, you know, that information in order to access it. So in theory, I think if you could get ICE to at least tell you what the passport number is, even if they're not willing to tell you anything else, you know, like that's her passport. Another option is, depending on what the country is, and obviously whether or not you have an asylum claim, you might be able to talk with the consulate to see if there could be like a Mexican records request to find out what that passport information is, because that should be accessible through the website. The other thing in this situation that I might try could be an ombudsman request. I don't actually know that that would work, but the thing is, this information is accessible.
Yeah, if it's not
CIS
related, then I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the issue is that because the USCIS ombudsman does that, or you can try to do a congressional liaison work. But I think that maybe try the Office of Biometric Identity Management, because it would be kind of an interaction with the border officer, and see if that gets you anything. Because it talks about like the biometric data collection at a port of entry, right? Which seems like your client had passed through a port of entry. I might kind of consider maybe congressional liaison, and if we at ASISTA can kind of do any liaison work to help you in terms of navigating the matter with ICE, would be happy to do that as well.
Okay, so we have a little more time. Are there any other questions that folks wanted to raise? If not, thank you very much for attending. If anybody missed the CLE announcement at the beginning, if you need a certificate of attendance and are not barred in Texas, then please shoot us an email and we will get that out to you. And as always, as OVW grantees, you are all eligible for free individual technical assistance on your cases. And so you can, if you have specific questions for us, you can submit those technical assistance requests to us. And also, if you aren't already on our listserv, please shoot us an email to get onto those listservs. It can be a really great resource as well. Rebecca's asking if we can get a copy of the PowerPoint sent to our emails. Yes, we will be sending that out in the follow-up email in the next few days.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. We appreciate your time with us today, and hope you have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.